Welcome to Clued In Mystery. I'm Sarah.
And I'm Brooke, and we both love mystery.
Good morning, Brooke.
Hi, Sarah. How are you doing?
I'm good, thank you. How are you?
Great, great.
So, today we are going to be talking about unreliable narrators, which is something I'm really looking forward to discussing with you.
I know it's been on our mind ever since we started the podcast, so this is going to be a fun conversation today.
Absolutely. Before we begin, I'll just do a quick spoiler note. So, in this episode, we are going to be speaking about big reveals and plot twists. And while we will try to avoid spoilers, we may be providing more details about the mysteries than we typically do. If you haven't read or watched the books and films listed in the show notes, you might want to do that first before you listen to the rest of the episode. So, let's get started. When we say unreliable narrator, we are talking about the narration or the point of view of a story. An unreliable narrator is lying or withholding information from the reader or the viewer, which can lead to a surprising twist when the truth is revealed. Sometimes withholding information is intentional, like in Gone Girl, and until the big reveal, there is no hint that the narrator has been untruthful and concealed their true motivation. Other times, the narrator is impaired, for example, by alcohol, which should be a clue to the reader that perhaps what the narrator is telling them may not be completely accurate. I personally get so wrapped up in the story that I usually miss that cue. The term unreliable narrator appeared for the first time in 1961 in The Rhetoric of Fiction by Wayne C. Booth. Since then, other literary scholars have identified characteristics of different types of unreliable narrators, creating lists of multiple categories. I'm not sure I would make quite so many distinctions, but I would break them down into three. So the first would be the naive narrator. This is typically someone who is young. Then we have the impaired narrator, and as I mentioned, this might be due to alcohol or to drugs. Finally, we have the intentionally unreliable or the lying narrator. In mystery, we see the impaired and the lying narrators most frequently. Think the woman in cabin 10, where we're not sure if she's reliable because she's been drinking or she's taking medication. And an example of the lying narrator would be the silent patient. Agatha Christie is credited with the first use of unreliable narration in 1926 with The Murder of Roger Ackroyd, when the narrator of that mystery is the murderer. For some context, this book was published shortly before her disappearance, which is why one of the theories about that time in her life was that it was a publicity stunt. In other words, that she was her own unreliable narrator. In the book, Poirot puts the truth together through a series of clever clues, but most readers, including me, even though I knew what the reveal was when I read it, don't put it together. This caused a huge stir for readers, and the book continues to be listed amongst the greatest mystery novels of all time, thanks, I'm sure, to the legacy of unreliable narrators that have followed. Which brings me to Gone Girl. Published in 2012, it has sold more than 20 million copies, and you could argue that it really led to a resurgence of novels featuring unreliable narration. So, Brooke, let's start our conversation by talking about Gone Girl. I think about my reaction when I read the book, and I wonder if it was similar to the way that readers reacted to Roger Ackroyd. It was just such a surprise. What do you think?
Oh, I love that comparison, Sarah. And, here we are in 2022, and we have a lot of examples of unreliable narrators. I mean, I would say since the Gone Girl explosion, that's become a trend and a really useful narrative device that we see often. But it was kind of a shock to us because it hadn't been something that had been in a lot of fiction. So it was so shocking, and I imagine it was the exact same when The Murder of Roger Ackroyd came out. I mean, clearly it hadn't been used in detective fiction at all. She was sort of the first one to use that in the Golden Age, and it had to have caused quite a stir. I can understand the controversy.
Yeah, and I just remember when Gone Girl came out, like there just was this so much buzz about it. And I have to say, people were very, very good about keeping the big reveal to themselves, right? People were, I think, because it was such, I don't know if enjoyable. I guess enjoyable is the right word. Like it just was such an enjoyable experience to reach that part of the book and be like, oh my goodness.
Yes.
Right. And you wanted other people to have that same experience. So certainly the people around me were very careful not to reveal what the big secret of the book was.
Yeah, I'm actually proud of us as a society that happened that way, because I know like a copy of it was passed around at the office I was working at the time. And I mean, I just think about the 15 to 20 people that were in that space, and we were like, okay, it's your turn. And the rest of the people would stand, by grinning, knowing what was going to be revealed. And yeah, you're right. I think that's something we could be proud of, at our ability to keep that secret and keep the joy for the next reader.
Yeah, you talked about the kind of explosion since Gone Girl. In preparing for our conversation today, I read an article that suggested that 680 novels have been published since 2012, with girl in the title. And that almost, either girl or woman in the title, is almost the signal that this book is going to have a wild, unexpected twist in it.
Yes, and interestingly enough, even though we know that when we pick up that title, it's the signal. There's going to be an unreliable narrator in this, but I fall for it every time. Like it doesn't lose its power. Like you said, I was really, really happy to hear you to admit that, with let's say the impaired narrator who's drinking a lot, or perhaps she's had a head injury. That's sometimes it's a injury that has caused her impairment. And that should be our big clue, but that you admitted that you usually still don't get the clue. And I'm in the same boat. And it's just such a credit to those authors to be able to make that work. But I also think it's a credit to us as readers that we really want that ride. So we're willing to suspend that disbelief a little bit and go on the journey.
Yeah, and I think that's exactly it, Brooke. I think generally audiences are trusting, right? Like we want to believe that what we're reading is the truth, and we enter into a contract, I think, with the author to suspend our disbelief, right? Rather than to be searching for those hints that things might not all be might not be as they're being portrayed. And I can think of one book that I've read where it was very clear from the beginning that the narrator was unreliable. And I thought, oh, this doesn't work, because I know that this is what's going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
But the author turned it around, and there was even more unreliability that I wasn't expecting. And so it actually worked out really, really well. And I was pleased that I read the whole book. But I can't think if there's any other examples that I've read where it's been obvious to me that this person isn't, what they're sharing is not what's going on.
These stories are a reason, maybe a good reminder to finish that book, because sometimes it's the big twist at the end that is the payoff. And so your comment was really good, because you thought you knew where that book was going, and maybe that it was kind of a tired plot, and then you were happily surprised. And I think that's something that an unreliable narrator story does, is that for a long time, sometimes you're just thinking you're watching this person's day-to-day life, and it's can get rather dull. Like, okay, here she is. She's getting drunk again and going to work and poorly managing her life. But you have to wait until that point where all the other pieces fall into place and the story pays off.
So I just want to pick up on something that you just mentioned about that the narrator is female, because a lot of the examples that I can think of unreliable narrators are female narrators. And, again, going back to the number of books with woman or girl, that's a signal that the narrator is going to be female. I've read a couple of books where the narrator, the unreliable narrator, has been male, and it almost comes as more of a surprise. But when I, put on my feminist hat for a moment, I wonder if audiences, because of the association with feminine or female unreliable narrators, I wonder if audiences haven't been primed to question the female point of view.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I have thought of this as well, and it reminds me of maybe in the Victorian era, she's got the vapors. She's hysterical, and I think that there is a common recurring trend to kind of paint women in that light. I also believe that it plays on the fact that the market for these books are women. And so it's easy for us to put ourselves in that person's shoes, perhaps easier than, because I don't feel like this is like a genre that's really focused on being marketed towards men. So I think we've got a little bit of both. We could look at it from two different ways, but I will agree that because I recently read a book where the narrator was male and everything got tipped on its head at the end, and I'm not even going to say the title because it would be a spoiler in and of itself. But I agree. I almost felt more shocked because it was a guy, and then I had to really question myself, like, well, what makes a man more trustworthy as a narrator? So, some deep thoughts after reading.
And just, to your comment about that the audience is typically female, I think most of the books that I can think of that have unreliable narrators fall into that domestic thriller category that we talked about in our domestic thriller episode, right? That, yeah, it's a story that you can very easily imagine you or someone leading a similar life to what is being portrayed in this book, and maybe that's part of the appeal as well, right? Like, and it maybe kind of goes back to our, like, what would you do question that we've asked in the past.
We do see male unreliable narrators in sort of the larger cast books where I'm thinking of maybe Lucy Foley's The Guest List or One by One by Ruth Ware. You've got a group of people, so you've got multiple point of view and you don't know who to trust. It's very likely that more than one of them that's telling this story is unreliable in some way. So you do see kind of all genders being represented there. But that's a different kind of story and a different kind of experience because you're not just living out that one narrator's telling of the story.
Yeah, that's a great point, because when you're reading the guest list, like, that someone in this cast of characters, at least one of them is up to no good, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so part of the enjoyment of reading that is trying to figure out, okay, whose side of the story can I trust? And maybe you can't trust any of them, right? Like, usually they've all got a secret
Mm-hmm.
that they're trying to keep. But yeah, do you find the shock or the surprise when you're in that one character's head, if it's a single narrator for the book? Do you find that shock or the surprise with the big reveal, do you find that satisfying?
I do. I think I don't know if I would use the word satisfying as much as like kind of a little bit of a thrill. When I think about that book that shall remain unnamed, I literally stood in my kitchen with my mouth gaping open, and I just had to like stand there. Like I was that in shock. That author got me that good. And, but it was so much fun. And I wanted to instantly, it was an audiobook I was listening to, and I instantly wanted to just start over again and see all the pieces and points that I had missed along the way. Yeah.
Yeah, I have to say I really admire when an author evokes that, as you say, that thrill that comes with that big reveal, right? So it's almost, there's something about reading a book where it's got girl or woman in the title and you know that, okay, this is going to be an unreliable narrator. But it's almost better when it's that you have no idea that that's coming.
Yes.
Right? Because I imagine that the title of that book, you said it was a male narrator, right? So there wouldn't have been woman or girl, I'm thinking, in the title. So you wouldn't have even had that clue that that you were in for such a treat.
Exactly. Yeah, and that's a really good point. And back to our comment about the sort of the feminist perspective on this. Like, wouldn't it be funny if we had the guy on the train? I mean, it just doesn't even work. The man in the window.
Either of those titles, I think, would evoke more of like a romance, I would think. Right?
Oh my goodness, yes.
Right? Like it, I don't know, maybe it's just me, but like that's what I would expect from that title. The man on the train or the guy in the window. So what do you think? Like, we've both kind of talked about how we tend to miss those cues that this book is going to have a big reveal, have an unreliable narrator. What do you think makes those stories work, right? Like I don't think there's a bigger signal to a reader that, hey, there's going to be something that you're not expecting in this book than having girl or woman in the title. And still, people are like, wow, that twist was such a shocker. Like, what is it that I mean, maybe it's what we've talked about before about that trust that we have as readers, that what we're reading is going to be truthful. But I don't know. Do you have any thoughts about that?
I loved that you said that we make a contract, and I think that's completely true. Like when you begin a book, you as a reader, you buy in. You're like, okay, I'm going to go along with this and go along on the ride. But I wonder if there's also some deeper things that we really enjoy about this because, Ruth Ware writes a lot of her books have some level of unreliable narrator in there. And I read an article and a quote by her is, "We are all unreliable narrators." And I wonder if there's some, human nature in there because we all have our own filter. If you and I sat through the same event and then we retold it to our friends, we would have two different stories. And so it's very, I feel like the narrative device is very real life. We're all going to tell the story with our own perceptions and, our own life experiences. So maybe that's part of what makes it so satisfying in the end. I don't know.
No, I think that I think that's it, Brooke. I think you're right that, as you say, we all interpret things. We all have our own interpretation of events, and so when we're reading something, whether it's a multiple point of view with multiple narrators, it becomes very clear there that there's different perceptions of what's going on. But even with a single narrator, yeah, you get that. I think that's a really good point.
I was thinking about the way our memories fade and they get kind of jumbled up, and our memories contort to the way we wanted it to be, or sometimes opposite. Sometimes they contort to, the worst case scenario of that event. And so that plays a part, the way our memories work in these types of stories too.
Yeah. I mean, I don't trust my memory, so
the more
people shouldn't
years
trust
that
my
pass,
stories.
the more years that pass, the less I trust my memories.
Yeah. Yeah. So I looked up, some articles to see lists of books with unreliable narrators, and yeah, it's a little bit it's a bit of a funny thing to list, because if you know that the narrator is unreliable, like, does that take away some of the enjoyment
Mm-hmm.
of the book? But Rebecca was on a couple of those lists, and I don't know. I guess, Rebecca, you could consider that narrator to be naive, right? And
Mm-hmm.
if you're thinking about the different um, categories that I talked about, I think that narrator might be a naive narrator. But um, I don't know if I would. Would you put Rebecca on a list of unreliable narrators?
Yeah, that one surprised me too. I think you're right. It must fall into that um, naive character. And I did some of the same looking around, and they were, also referencing Forrest Gump, which would have been a naive narrator. And then Michael Scott from The Office. Again, it was a surprising example, but I get it, because his perspective is not accurate. And as the audience, we know that, like, right off the bat, right? That, okay, this guy is not going to be telling things the
Mm-hmm.
way that they truly are. But I had never thought about a narrator in a comedy, or I had never considered an unreliable narrator in a comedy situation. So that was kind of a fun thing to think about.
Yeah, and that's a good point. Like, unreliable narration is not limited to mystery. I mean, we've been
Mm-hmm.
talking about mysteries, but Fight Club is not a mystery, but certainly there's unreliable narrator. And then the film The Sixth Sense as well, right? Like, I think you could say um, that was an unreliable narrator, but it wasn't. I guess it was naive, right? Because he didn't accept, or he didn't realize
Yeah, there was not a
what was
deliberate or
going on.
intentional um, trick to the
Yeah.
reader. But those are both two of my favorite movies: Fight Club, um, Sixth Sense. The Others is also same. It's a unreliable narration. Um, Excellent. And I was thinking that Fight Club is a predecessor to Gone Girl, and I wonder how much could have influenced that, when you see, so because and not a non-mystery film story that was very
Mm.
popular, wildly popular, and then if that influenced any of the mystery authors to think, oh, you know what, that's an excellent device to use, and we could use that over in the mystery space too.
Yeah, that's a really good question. Well, thanks, Brooke. I think this has been a really great conversation, talking about unreliable narrators, and some of the favorite book experiences that I've had recently.
Yeah, this has been great, Sarah. And like so many of our topics, I assume that we will probably return to it at some point. But for today, everyone, thank you for joining us on Clued in Mystery. I'm Brooke.
And I'm Sarah, and we both love mystery.